Good morning. It really is a pleasure to be here. As a couple of the speakers have noted, this is an amazing place to be technologically. In fact, this is an amazing city with 25 million people in it. It's interesting that South Korea apparently is rated #1 by the OECD for science and technology graduates. And Bloomberg, a very familiar business magazine, rates it #1 in innovation. So some of the things I'm going to say might seem a bit of a stretch, but after all, the theme of this conference is imagine, challenge, and create. So I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Imagine this. No one in this room needs to die. What? That can't be right. I must have misheard him. No one in this room needs to die. Well, obviously, these guys are trying to help with that. They're doing the research that, if it works out, will extend the human lifespan. And the goal, they might have been a little bit cagey about the end goal here, but the end goal is, let's get rid of aging. Not just slow it down and solve the problems by stretching out the curve and improving the economy, but a lot of people doing this work, really the end goal is to make aging just go away. That doesn't mean you're immortal, of course. Things can still kill you, but getting rid of aging, good idea. But we have a problem. In the meantime, we are aging right now, plus things happen like heart attacks, cancer. So how can I say that no one in this room needs to die? I'll come back to that. Let me just take a step back. Throughout most of human history, ever since we started developing the first tools, we have changed the external environment. We've created technology to change the world around us to suit us better. We're really just today in the early stages of changing the direction of that technology from out there to inside here, to change the human body, to change the brain, how the brain functions, to change our genetic structure, to change the aging process. We're in the early stages of that. You've seen quite a few of these technologies outlined already. Stem cells, cloning, which of course Korea is really a leader in, regenerative medicine, organ generation, actually growing organs in the lab now, out of stem cells, actually growing proto-organs. It used to be science fiction to say, in the next few years we'll be growing organs. It's no longer, sounds at all unlikely, within the next 10 years or so. So that we're beginning to have a new direction here, and there's a philosophical view that expresses both the possibility and the desirability of using technology to transform the human condition, not just the external world, our fundamental condition. When I say the human condition, what do I mean? That's kind of a vague term. Well, I really mean the fundamental makeup of what it is to be human. We are beginning to have choices about that. We're going to change the way we think, the way we feel, how long we live. It's always been part of human nature to be mortal. That's a rather unfortunate design flaw. I think it should be up to us to decide how long we live. It's possible that, according to many people, you get bored if you live long enough. Someone sometimes asks me, do you really want to live forever? I said, I don't know. Ask me again in 1,000 years. I can't tell you right now. But how do we get from here to there? Well, the transhumanist view says that not only is it a desirable thing, not as a possible thing, it's actually desirable to change the human condition. It's kind of our responsibility. After all, who else is going to do it? Only human beings. Human beings, as far as we know, we don't know who else is out there in the universe, human beings are the conscious part of the universe. That's the way I like to think of it. We're part of the universe, we're natural beings, but most of the universe doesn't really think. Some animals kind of think a little bit, but we're the only ones with a true conceptual awareness who can decide to change our nature. So if we don't do it, nobody else is really going to. So in the idea of transhumanism, and particularly the concept of extropy, you may have heard of entropy. In entropy, the idea is in physics and thermodynamics, in a closed system, one with no energy coming from the outside, everything will tend towards disorder and decay. Now, the reason why that doesn't happen on Earth, the reason why we have evolution and things get more complex and evolve, is it's not a closed system. We have energy coming from the sun that powers that increasing order. The concept of extropy is not a technical term, it's more of a metaphor, really bringing across the idea that in an open system, you can use that incoming energy in the form of technology, guided by reason and imagination, and the ability to be challenged and to shape it the way you want, and use that to keep increasing order and complexity. And if you do this, if you just keep doing this long enough, you have the idea of perpetual progress. That's part of the transhumanist idea. We've had the idea of progress for a little while. It hasn't always been around. There have been times in human history, or I should say, big chunks of different parts of the planet. For instance, in Europe, we had the Dark Ages for a long time. Actually, there were some changes then, but really, compared to today, there was no change very much for 1,000 years. So perpetual progress is not something that happens on its own. It's something we have to make happen. So, okay, we have this idea that the world can keep improving, getting better through conscious choice and effort. And most important, I think, for us here today is to apply that in the area of life extension. Let's not accept the idea that we age and die by 70 or 80. It used to be 30 or 40. Actually, for many people, it was pretty much 0. Many people died in childbirth. Many women died in childbirth. Many of their children didn't make it. That's why in many cultures we still have too many children. That's been changing because most of them would die, and so you have to kind of overshoot to make sure you have enough children to take care of yourselves. Aging and death seem inevitable, but they're not, right? Everybody agrees it's not inevitable. We're going to do something about it. But in the meantime, we have this problem. As I said, things can happen. Maybe you're already kind of old. Maybe you're going to have a heart attack. Maybe you have an aneurysm, a stroke. All kinds of things can happen to you. So how do we get from here to there? The world where there is no more aging. If I have time, I'll try to address a little bit about why that's actually a good thing and why it's desirable. A lot of people say, well, this is not natural. It's not natural for humans to live indefinitely. Again, I'm not using the word forever because it's not forever. An asteroid could land on your head, and that's the end of you. Someone could shoot you. There's all kinds of things that could happen. I'm just talking about agelessness, not immortality. Is it really unnatural? Well, that's why I like the idea that we are part of nature. We are the conscious part of nature that creates progress. How can it be unnatural for us to use our natural capabilities to change the world, including ourselves? I think that's a very natural thing. It would not really be natural for humans to fail to do that, I think. All right, so there's a big gap here. We've got this future, sometime in the future, depends on who you ask. Super optimistic people think, oh, maybe in about 30 years, especially with artificial intelligence helping out, we might have solved all these problems. Alex was talking about how his machines, AI, and I think Bill too, can sort through more and more chemicals, chemical combinations, looking for targets and solutions. If that keeps improving, maybe in 30 years we will have solved all these problems, but we don't really know that for sure. Well, there is a way. There is something we can do. How do you get this to move forward? Oh, there we go. Nope. The down button, okay. Oh, that's the button that goes ping.
Max, you're holding it in the wrong direction. Yeah, absolutely.
But it's still not going to anything.
Just, try it another time. There is one slide.
Oh, they didn't put the other slides on that. Okay. All right, so we don't have my other slides, but that's fine. All right, so getting from here to there requires some way of basically kind of a time travel, if you like, medical time travel. If there's a future in which we don't age and die, there is a way of getting there. And I said nobody in this room has to die. I'm going to make good on that promise because there is a means you can use right now which has a pretty good chance of working and allowing you to get to that time in the future when this is no longer a problem. What is that solution? What does that mean? It's called cryopreservation, human cryopreservation, or usually for short, just cryonics. How many people have heard of that? I have no idea how well known it is in South Korea. Cryonics? Okay, just a few people. Well, I think all the Americans, actually. Okay, this is not a very familiar idea. Well, right now we use very cold temperatures to preserve all kinds of tissues. If you think about it, we cryopreserve corneas, heart valves, skin, sperm, eggs, and of course in vitro fertilization. If you think about it, there are actually a couple of million people walking around the planet today who were cryopreserved at one point. They're in liquid nitrogen or liquid nitrogen vapor at extremely cold temperatures. Of course, they were embryos at the time. They were implanted and they grew up. Interestingly, some of those embryos, there are siblings who were actually conceived at the same time but are born 16 or more years apart. So that shows that you can actually put life on hold, at least at that stage. There's also a lot of research into organ cryopreservation. This is an area that could save a huge number of lives. There are so many people dying every year because they cannot get a tissue match. They need a heart or lung or kidneys, and it's not available. Maybe there's someone across the other side of the continent, which in the US is kind of a long way, who might have a tissue match, but they can't get it to you on time. They will cool it down and try and protect it and get it to the patient, but 100,000 people per year are dying because they can't get organs. There is research going on right now including a partner to the organization I work with, the Alcohol Life Extension Foundation, a company in California that has actually successfully cryopreserved rabbit kidneys, which means they've put them essentially at a super cold temperature, cryogenic temperatures, kept them there for months, rewarmed them using some very special methods, implanted it into the rabbit, and that kidney functioned again. If you can do that, just imagine you can have cryobanking of tissues. You can keep them all in a bank, in a hospital. If you need one, we take it out, throw it out, pop it in, you're good to go. So that could save a huge number of lives. That's something that has actually already been done to a limited extent, and it's quite plausible that in 10 years we'll be able to do a lot more of that. So before I get to the details of human cryopreservation, I want to point out that we're already doing this to a certain degree. We're doing it to individual tissues, dozens of different tissues we can cryopreserve reversibly. We're starting to do it to whole organs, which is more difficult. And if you think about it, the brain is kind of the important part. The brain's an organ. So if we can show we can do it to organs, that means presumably we can do it to the brain. And the brain is the most important part. This is all replaceable. We live inside here. We are essentially encoded in the physical structure of our brains, in the connections inside the neural bodies. If you can preserve that, you've been preserved. You've basically been put on hold. It's like pushing a button, to oversimplify, the pause button. Everything's on hold. You can unpause it later in the future when we have the technology to actually reverse that process and reverse the aging process. We're not going to bring you back as an old person. That would be a bit pointless. So that's already in the works. That's already starting to happen. Now, I said I'm talking about reversing the process. It's more difficult with complex organisms. But the great thing about cryopreservation is you don't have to be able to do that today. You can wait. Once you're stored in liquid nitrogen, and that's how we store people, it's a very convenient, relatively inexpensive storage medium, that's at minus 196 degrees Celsius, minus 320 Fahrenheit. That's very, very cold, far colder than the freezer you have in your fridge. That's good for a few months. This is good for actually thousands and thousands of years, much longer than we should need. So it looks pretty plausible this is something we can do. Plus, the scientific and medical communities are beginning to pay attention a bit more and no longer to dismiss this as science fiction, partly because they see organ cryopreservation research, also because there are other areas that are starting to come together. It used to be that cryonics was over here and medicine was over here, and now they're kind of starting to meet in the middle a little bit. So apart from the organ cryopreservation work, another area is low-temperature surgery. You might have come across this. For a while now, people have been dropping people in temperature by about 10 degrees C. Now, what's the purpose of this? It's really to slow down metabolism. So it's the same process that I'm talking about, but only the very beginning stages. Now, more recently, there's been a bit more radical attempt by Dr. Peter Ree, who's based quite near me, actually, in the University of Arizona in Tucson, working with a hospital in Pittsburgh. What he's doing is taking people with gunshot wounds or other very severe trauma who normally could not be operated on because they just bleed out on the operating table. They just bleed out too fast, you can't operate. But by reducing them all the way down from the 30s down to just 10 degrees C, much colder than anybody's done human surgery before, he's able to extend the time he has to work by 400%. So everything's slowed down. You've got time to work. Well, we're just saying, well, let's take this a little bit further. And actually, Dr. Ree has been to visit Alcor, and he didn't say, oh, this is not going to work. He said, oh, yeah, this is pretty sensible. This basic principle is right. You're kind of more radical than what I'm doing, but yeah, this is worth trying. So this is what we do, the basic process. People make arrangements in advance. You don't want to leave this to the last minute. That's a very bad idea. So people make arrangements. They fund it usually with life insurance. It's not really that expensive for a surgical procedure, but life insurance usually covers it very easily. In a good situation, which isn't always the case, we'll be at your bedside. We'll send out a standby team, as we call them, because they stand by at the bedside and they wait. And because of the law today, and this may well change, we have to wait until a doctor says, I declare you legally dead. Now, what does that mean? Some people say, well, what's the point that they're dead? Well, that's not really very imaginative. After all, just think back 50 years or so. Let's say that someone here stopped breathing. Their heart stopped, they stopped breathing. 50 years ago, we would have checked, yeah, he's dead. Take him away, burn him, bury him, whatever you do. We don't do that today. We say, well, that's pretty irresponsible. Let's get someone here, let's do CPR, let's defibrillation if we have to. There's all kinds of things we can do to resuscitate the person. So 50 years ago, we said, they're dead. Today, we don't think that. We say, well, they will be dead if we don't do something soon. What we're saying is when today, it's really just the same situation, today the doctor says you're dead, the doctor's actually wrong. You will be dead if we don't intervene. The purpose of cryonics is really an extension of emergency medicine. We're saying, don't give up at that point. That's crazy. You've got to stop them getting worse. And how do you do that? Well, what we do is the standby team will take you from the hospital bed, put you into an ice bath. I would have had a picture to show you of that. If you go to the website at alcor.org, alcor.org, you can find lots of illustrations of this process. We'll put you in the ice bath, add water to it, circulate icy water around you to accelerate the cooling process. We're then going to restart respiration. We have a machine that basically does CPR. That gets pretty tiring if you do it manually, you'll find. So the machine does it perfectly and tirelessly. We also have a respirator, so you replace your breathing. So even though you're being called dead, we're actually starting everything up again. And we're going to give you about 16 different medications in the current protocol to protect the cells. So this part of the procedure looks a lot like what happens with organ transplant. You want to keep the tissues viable for as long as possible. So the injections we give start with propofol, which, at least in America, everybody knows, thanks to Michael Jackson, who took too much of it and stopped breathing. But the idea of that is to slow metabolism. It also just makes sure you won't wake up during this process, because just because you're supposedly dead doesn't mean you couldn't wake up. But there's a bunch of other things, antacids, membrane stabilizers, a lot of other things we put in there to protect the cells. And then we're going to move you from the hospital or hospice bed to our facility, Alcor. There could be a few other steps, but I'll keep this relatively simple. At Alcor, we call in a surgeon. We have a bunch of surgeons on call, and they will, say for a whole body case, some people just preserve the brain. After you can get rid of the rest, you can replace it, maybe clone it or regenerate it. You guys know about cloning, so I probably don't need to convince you too much that that's a feasible thing. But if it's a whole body, they usually go in through the chest, much like what's called a median stenotomy, access the major blood vessels of the heart, and then we'll connect your vascular system to a pump and a chiller, which also I had a slide of, and that will gradually remove the blood and the fluids from inside the cells over a period of a few hours and replace them with a cryoprotectant solution. Cryoprotectant is simply a medical-grade antifreeze. So this is designed to be as minimally toxic as possible while actually reducing or eliminating ice formation. Ice is not good. It won't necessarily destroy the cells entirely. That's actually a misconception, but it will certainly do a lot of damage. So we try to eliminate the ice formation and not freeze the patient, but vitrify. Vitrify comes from the word for glass. Essentially, the material, as you cool it down, becomes more and more viscous and locks everything in place with no internal structure, no crystal structure to damage the cell membranes. And that was what was used in the rabbit kidney. It's exactly what happened there. It was vitrified, and it was reversible. At that point, once you've got you vitrified, once you're cryoprotected, we can plunge the temperature way down very rapidly, and then we've got to slow down a little bit because you really become a solid, and if you drop down too quickly, fracturing can happen, different tissues contract at different rates. But eventually you end up at this incredibly cold temperature, minus 196 degrees C, minus 320 Fahrenheit. At that temperature, you can sit there for 100 years, and you'll be just as good as you were after 1 hour. Everything has stopped. It hasn't just slowed down greatly, it's actually truly stopped at that point. Anything below about minus 130 degrees C is fine, actually. And then you wait. And you wait for these guys to solve the big problem of aging. That's got to be solved. No point coming back old and decrepit just to conk out again. But and you have to wait until we have maybe a medical nanotechnology or whatever it takes to repair the damage to the cells from whatever killed you in today's sense, plus the additional damage that is definitely done by the cryopreservation process. Now, one of the slides I would have showed you is how we keep people. Basically, we're stored in very large, 10 feet tall metal containers called dewars, after Sir James Dewar from Scotland. But it's easy to imagine what these are like. If you've ever had a cup of coffee out of a thermos flask or a hot or cold drink, thermos flasks, they have a little vacuum layer, and they keep the temperature of your drink. These are like very large, very expensive thermos flasks. And they usually contain 4 whole-body patients and often several brains, too. So our main job at Alcor is to keep you alive, or keep you maintained. You're not really alive at that point. You're kind of on hold, because you're on pause, until we have the technology to bring you back. And you might say, well, how do I know you'll be here long enough? Well, that's a good question. We've been around for 45 years now, and there's another organization that's been in 42 years. So some of us have some experience, and we are dedicated to the long haul. We're set up as a non-profit organization. We put a big chunk of the money that's paid into a separate fund that's managed by a board of trustees separate from our board of directors. 2/3 of them have to have a loved one who's been cryopreserved. So they have a very personal and direct stake in maintaining that money. And we have a rule, don't ever take out more than 2% a year, because what happens if we go like Japan and the market just doesn't ever go up for a quarter of a century? Well, 2% is a relatively safe draw. And that's been doing quite well. So this is definitely a big goal, right? This is kind of a challenge. People say, well, that's never going to work. But you know what? Why shouldn't it work? We have all this evidence coming in that we can actually cryopreserve all kinds of tissues, organs, and in fact, we even have direct evidence from brains. There are vitrified brains of a number of species now, where we've been able to take an electron microscope and look at it at the synaptic level and the neural level, and we can see if it's been done right. Everything is intact. The cell membranes are intact, the neurons are there, the connections are still there, so you are still there. We're just waiting for a chance to bring you back. Now, I think this is something that Korea can easily overtake the United States in. Recently, I've seen a lot of interest from China, and they've actually started the first organization over there. This country is tremendous for innovation and technology, so part of the conference is about challenge. I challenge you to do something about this. I'll be happy to talk to anybody who wants to try and get something going. I think obviously you have the infrastructure technologically, I think you have the will, and you're able to overcome traditional thinking. So I think cryonics could be a very big thing here, and as I said at the end, if you do this, no one in this room has to die. Thank you.